Hello, welcome to the National Road Heritage Corridor's Heritage Stewards Academy. I'm Jen Burden, Director of Cultural Resources for the National Road. In this episode, Wendy Burtner of Nonprofit Sidekick talks about succession planning for nonprofits. We all need to make sure our organizations can smoothly transition when staff or volunteers leave and board members' terms expire.
Hi, I'm Wendy Burtner, one of the founders of Nonprofit Sidekick, a coaching, consulting, and training firm that serves the nonprofit sector. Today, we're going to talk about the basics of succession planning. This has been a hot topic for a couple of years in the nonprofit sector. We've had a lot of organizations that over the past maybe 5 years, and I think 10 years out, we're still going to see it. The baby boomer generation is retiring from their leadership roles, so we need to plan for who's coming in after them. There's also the constant need for succession planning at the board level. So why would you do succession planning? Why does it matter? The first and maybe most important point is to prevent the loss of knowledge, especially in the nonprofit sector, especially in the smaller nonprofits. That we tend to be very localized and, this is the person that does the fundraising, this is the person that does the finance, whatever that might be. That knowledge sits in one person at a time. So doing a little planning, thinking ahead of time, what if we lose, when they go, whatever that question is that you're trying to answer, you want to try to prevent that loss of legacy knowledge and practices. And so on the tail of that, it's minimizing the risk of the organization failing. When you don't have that knowledge, that information, those processes in place, it takes a long time for new ones to come in and everybody to agree on them. And in the meantime, the organization might just falter around a little bit, and that's not good. You want to retain relationships. Again, people are kind of siloed, and within those silos, they have relationships. The finance person might have great relationships with the bank, and when they go, who's going to come in and build that relationship again? What about partners, strategic partners, all of that? They will walk away if the organizational leader, the person they have the relationship with, if that person leaves and nobody is there before the person leaves, kind of building a relationship, that has a chances are that that's just not going to stay around, that relationship. Financial stability, for all the reasons we just talked about, chances are you're going to lose donors. You're going to lose grantors too. If they don't trust the new leader, if it just comes out of the blue, you could have some real financial issues. You want to create a strong transition for new leadership. This reduces frustration and reduces the loss of additional talent as well. So if you have a really good plan and process in place before the person leaves and you are already doing some of this work ahead of time, then your finances are going to be okay, your relationships and partnerships are going to be okay, and the organization will be okay. So before we start, there are a couple of different stages of succession planning. If you are kind of less than 2 months and you need to find a new leader, you're in a bit of an emergency situation and you don't have a plan in place, right? That becomes an emergency. If you have 2 to 6 months, we consider that an executive search, right? Don't really have the time to do a plan. You're going to have to do a search. And then if it's more than 6 months, then you have time to do a really good plan. And you can do a plan for different positions and start developing people and all of that. But really, if it's under 6 months, it's a little bit of a different animal. You can't announce the ED's resignation and it's going to be effective in 2 months and say, oh, let's do some succession planning. No, at that point, you got to be ready for the search and all of that. You kind of missed the window, unfortunately. So what could trigger an emergency transition? And really, we're doing succession planning to decrease the emergency side of this, right? In case you could have a board chair turnover. This could trigger transitions in many other places, in other board members and senior staff, if you have staff. That could trigger an emergency transition pretty pretty quickly. You could have significant board turnover. Maybe the board chair is still there, but a bunch of the board leave unexpectedly. You might see some other staff, some other leaders are turning over at the same time or shortly thereafter. The executive director could get a not so great performance evaluation. That's going to set them on the path pretty quickly of exiting. They might resign. There might be some crisis with the executive director, internal or external, where they feel compelled to resign or you have to fire them. The proverbial bus, or as I prefer, the lottery win. Instead of saying they get hit by the bus, so they're not coming in tomorrow, I like to say they hit the lottery, so they're calling in rich and they're not coming in anymore. But that's an emergency transition as well. But the most common trigger for an emergency transition is procrastination. It's the lack of having a plan. And so when you find yourself in that situation, it becomes a crisis. It becomes an emergency very, very quickly. So when we're talking about succession planning, we're talking about being proactive, right? We're not talking about we have this issue right now and we have to deal with it. We're talking about this may happen. Well, eventually it will happen, right? People don't live forever. People leave. Board members roll off, whatever that might be. So you have to be proactive in thinking about it. You can't be shy and be like, oh, I don't want to talk about when so-and-so leaves. You really have to think about that might happen. It needs to be collaborative. A lot of people around the organization need to have input into what does this look like. It can be other board members, it can be staff, there might even be funders or volunteers, other people that you consider stakeholders that you want to involve in the process of what do we do when our leader leaves or has to leave. There's a self-assessment piece to it where you're looking at how are we doing? How does this position impact our organization? What are the needs? So you have to do a little bit of an assessment around, what's going on at the organization. And then it's expectation setting alongside that, right? It's here's what we're going to do, just so you know, this is going to be your responsibility when this happens. So it's setting that expectation for other people in the organization as well. There's a bit of it that's prep work. That's your emergency plan. Like what happens when your leader gets hit by a bus and you have to put this plan into effect right away. There's a section of it that has to be kind of that emergency. So you have to be prepped for that at all times. So there are 4 pieces to a good succession plan: communications planning, financial management, risk management, and interim management of the organization. And essentially what we're going to ask you to do in each of those sections is think of the worst case scenario and what do you need to do to either balance it or prevent it. So in terms of financial management, right off the beginning of this, you want to think about if you're the person who's in charge of your finances, financial management, your ED or your finance director or what have you, if they hit the lottery, they don't come back, how do you get into the accounts, right? That's like a very basic question, but it's the best example of you need to have those passwords, you need to know the process, you need to know what bank. I mean, I've actually had a situation where a client was like, I wasn't even sure where the bank was. So was it this one or that one? So we had to work together to figure it out. You want to make sure you're keeping the information safe and guarded, right? Especially when we're talking about login, when we're talking about financial management, that type of thing. You really want to make sure you're keeping it safe. You want to review the answers periodically. So if you do a succession plan today and a year from now, chances are passwords have changed, money might have changed hands where you have a different person managing your investment or your bank account or what have you. But I don't want you to think this is just passwords either. It's processes. It's who's the relationship. What relationships do you have with people? It's all of that in each of those sections. So when we talk about communications planning, you want to think about the worst case scenario. You have this emergency. Let's say the worst case scenario is your ED gets arrested. You have to be ready. Who's going to talk to the press? Who in the press are you going to talk to? What relationships do you already have? right? What's the message? Or who's going to come up with that message, because you don't know what that message is going to be until it actually happens. So for planning, it's all of those types of things. And so it's same with the financial management. As soon as that happens, you're going to want to lock down your accounts. So you need all of that account information. You need to know who your relationships are with at the bank or at the other firms. All of that has to take into account. Risk management. What insurance do you have? Who's trained to do what jobs? Do you have some training of people over here that know how to do the basic bookkeeping if you lose your finance person, right? What kind of risk management do you already have in place? That needs to be documented so people know. Interim management. This is really crucial from an HR perspective. And if we're talking about staff, board, it's a little more straight line. Staff, there's a little bit, is there somebody on staff that might be able to step up and be the interim ED, or are you bringing in somebody from the outside? Is a board member going to be able to take that over? I've heard of all three of those scenarios happening. So you have to kind of think about what's going to be best. And these are all things that go into your plan so that you're ready when an emergency hits, right? When you have that very short window. So the process for staff leadership succession, there's kind of 3 steps to it. Sustaining. So ideally, I've heard 1 to 2 years before the start of the transition, you want to start thinking about it. You want to start putting plans in place. You want to start thinking about who might be the replacement. Is there somebody on staff? And at this point, this would be an executive director announces their retirement, right? And they typically give several months notice for that. Sometimes it's several years notice, but that leader is going to stay in place. They're working towards leaving the organization, and the board prepares for the search, right? During this time is when you identify the knowledge transfer. You want to say, these are the things that are crucial to my job. I've heard people refer to it as desk manuals in different organizations. So like, here's everything you need to know to do my job. So that's really important. Where does that information go within the organization? Who's doubling up on that information? Your ED knows something. Who else needs to know it? So that's kind of the first step in the process, is this sustaining, making sure that you have a really strong foundation as you go through the transition. The second, you start to transition. And you start to do that hands-off, right? The leader is still there. They're still sustaining the organization, but you might have, if it's the executive director, then you're going to have a search. The board is probably going to be very involved in that. It's going to be all hands on deck. There's going to be a lot of communication going around. So there's this added work on top of the work of keeping the organization going. But you can't lose sight of sustaining, of keeping the organization going. You don't want to miss grant proposal deadlines, that type of thing. So it's really important that this is acknowledged as the transition period of the process. And then there's onboarding. So this is, especially for an ED again, you might have overlap. You might be able to have the ED stay for a month and the new person that you hire comes in and they kind of overlap for a week, a month, whatever. You want to make sure that that time period is agreed upon and communicated on both sides. You need to be specific about what is going to happen during that time period. And then let that leader go. The exiting leader needs to have an end date and say, this is when you're ending, now you go. Theoretically, you already have all the support in place within the organization and the board for the new leader to be successful. Occasionally, you might have to have a phone call or two. What you don't want is for the exiting leader to kind of linger around. That's uncomfortable for pretty much everybody. You want to have that end date and keep it moving and work through it that way. Make sure that the plan has plenty of time for that to happen. So during that sustaining, that first kind of piece of the process, some of the concrete things that you want to do is look at the job description. Does the job description match what that leader's been doing? It may not, especially if the leader's been there for a while. So you might have to write up a whole new job description that clarifies kind of the roles and responsibilities. You want to clarify the responsibilities between the board and the staff. You want to identify and train any internal candidates. Like, hey, if there's somebody who looks like they might be a good fit, start to talk to them. What do they need to move into this? Most leaders, most executive directors are really good at that piece of it, but they need to communicate that with the board to let the board know that this is happening. You want to make sure that everybody agrees on the search process and that there's some sort of plan in place. People always ask, should we do strategic planning? My answer is no. If you don't have one at this point, let the new leader come in, get used to it, and then do a strategic plan. You might have strategy. You might say, okay, for this year, here are our goals. Here's the strategies we're going to do to get to those goals. But you might not do that deep dive. You might not have the capacity to do the deep dive, especially if you're going through this transition. So that's the first phase. Those are some concrete things that happen during the first phase. The second phase is that search. So the leader's going to really focus on managing the staff, managing the organization, continuing to be transparent and supportive. They're going to help prepare for the onboarding and the knowledge transfer. However, again, if it's 2 weeks or a month or whatever, they agree to that. And you want to make sure that you have a communications plan in place for announcing the new leader. The communication plan should be phased so that like your funders, your really important VIP friends, get that information first before it goes public. You need to decide who that is. But down to, your landlord. Your landlord should get an email or a letter that says, hey, welcome our new leader. So that communication plan should be pretty robust and pretty detailed. So phase 3, when you're doing the onboarding, this is not just a day or a moment or an hour or a lunch. The first day is super important, but it's more than that. And I just have to tell the story. When I was hired as an ED one time, I came into the office, nobody was there. So I was kind of waiting for people to come. So the other staff eventually came in. Who are you? Oh, okay, yeah. Oh, yeah, this is your new day. They kind of weren't even sure it was going to be my first day. And then they took me to my office. They were expanding and they had already given away the executive director's office to somebody else on staff. And the executive director's office was going to be in the new expanded area. So they gave me a desk in the corner of the supply and copier room, which just didn't make me feel all that welcome. I'm not saying it was a horrible thing. Did it end my day? No, but it just, between nobody kind of being there to welcome me and then here's your desk and nobody even told me how to turn on my computer and work it. There was just absolutely no thought put into onboarding. So do a little bit more than that is what I'm saying. If you can, have a good plan. Have board members there on the first day. Take the new person out to lunch. Whatever you can do to make them really feel welcome. You should have a plan for their first 100 days. You should have some goals for them so that they are very clear that, hey, I know I need to meet these people. I know I need to do these things. I need to evaluate this. You should have that kind of first 100-day plan for them. Allow them to decide how they're going to do things, but give them some goals or some items that they have to do. And then conduct stay interviews at 30, 60, 90 days. Make sure somebody, usually it's the board chair, but it might be somebody else on the board, is meeting with the executive director or that senior staff person and saying, how are you doing? How are you doing on the first 100-day plan? How are you doing on other things? And really just kind of working through, this can be a lunch or a coffee, but it's not the casual, hey, how are you? It really is kind of an interview of how are you doing and a report out. Where can I support you better? You want to definitely plan for internal and external relationship building. So make sure that they know and they have time to go meet people, whether it's internally or externally, funders, partners, whatever. That is so important, and the exiting leader should really help them with that if at all possible. If not, if they can't do that, if the exiting leader is gone, the bus, whatever, they're already in Tahiti in retirement, Other people around should definitely be able to help make introductions and make sure that those relationships are sustained. You want to have lots of conversations around strategy and vision of the organization. You want to make sure that and ideally this happened during the interview process, but they get in there, you really want to make sure that they are aligned with everybody else in the organization, and they're not going to come in and all of a sudden take the organization, on a left turn. That's going to upset staff. That's going to upset volunteers. You're just going to see massive amounts of turnover unless that's what you want. But that's pretty rare that you would want that. So, you want to make sure that they're all aligned. And as a board, the board is going to be more involved than usual. You can't rely on staff that report to this leader to do this work. The board has to do this work and build that relationship with the organization or with the new leader. So when we talk about the 3 phases, this can also transition to boards, right? When you get people on boards, when you are recruiting them in, it's good to know, and maybe it's a shorter timeline, but it's good to think about, I'm on a board, I'm going to go off the board at the end of the year, who's going to replace me? And that's something I, as a board member, can start thinking about. Now, I might not recruit that person. The nominating committee, other people on the board might recruit them because I'm going off, but it's always helpful to kind of think about how can I as a board member aid in this transition? How can I as a board member help that new person, especially if I held some sort of committee chair or something like that? How do we help that new person come into that role and be very successful and not have to make it all up and get that onboarding for them that is just critical for this transition to be successful? So what did we talk about today when we're talking about succession planning for boards and staff? So we talked about the 4 ingredients of a really good succession plan. It's a communications plan. Who's going to talk to who, when, where, how, what vehicles are you going to use? That should be pretty robust. The financial management, you want to make sure that there is no gap in that information, that nobody is freaking out, that you can change that login information as soon as possible, especially if this is an emergency type of transition. Who are the relationships that you need to know that people need to have in order for there to be no crisis around the finances? You want to talk about risk management. You want to know, what insurances do you have in place? What backups do you have in place? Have you gotten all of the passwords and everything from that person? That should be part of your plan. And you want to think about interim management. If you lose this position, do you need somebody else to come in? So those are kind of the 4 areas of your succession plan. And then you want to remember the process: sustaining, transitioning, and onboarding. So sustaining is kind of preparing. The transitioning is when that transition actually happens. What do you need to be doing? What kind of information do you need to be tracking, or relationships are you building? And then the onboarding. You don't want to just have somebody come in and give them a desk in the corner of the copy room. You want to make sure they know how to log onto their computer. Step 1, who are their staff? Who else is there? But also, what relationships? What's your 100-day plan? Really, again, nurture them. Make sure they feel welcome. Make sure that they feel useful and that they are going to engage. So thank you so much. I hope that this was a very short overview of succession planning, but I hope this is useful as you continue down the road of success for your organization.